I needed to get away. The city was too loud, too distracting. As a writer, I craved solitude and silence, a place where I could immerse myself in my work without interruption. So, I rented a secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was perfect, quiet, isolated, and surrounded by nature. The first few days were blissful. I woke up early, wrote for hours, and took long walks in the afternoons. The cabin was cozy, with a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a loft where I slept. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. It was exactly what I needed. But on the fourth night I saw him. I was sitting at the small desk by the window, typing away, when I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing. He was barely visible in the fading light, but I could make out his outline, a tall, thin man, standing unnaturally still. I stared back, waiting for him to move, to come closer or go away, but he just stood there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest. I got up and went to the door, stepping outside into the cool night air. The figure was gone. I walked to the edge of the clearing, scanning the woods, but there was no sign of him. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light. The next night, he was back. This time, he was closer, standing just a few feet from the cabin. I could see more details now, a pale face, dark eyes, and ragged clothes. He was still, too still, as if he wasn't really there. I felt a surge of fear and anger. Who was this man, and what did he want? I rushed outside again, but he disappeared before I could reach him. I spent the rest of the night peering out the window, but he didn't return. My days were productive, filled with writing and exploration, but my nights were plagued by the figure. Every night he appeared, always watching, always disappearing before I could confront him. My sleep became fitful, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and cold eyes. My work began to suffer. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't escape the growing paranoia that gnawed at my mind. I decided to find out more about the cabin. Maybe there was something in its history that could explain the figure. I drove to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a tiny library. The librarian was a kind old woman who seemed delighted to have a visitor. She helped me dig through old records and newspapers. What I found was chilling. Over the past 50 years, there had been several disappearances in the area. Hikers, campers, and even a few locals had vanished without a trace. The articles mentioned a local legend about a watcher in the woods, a ghostly figure seen by those who went missing. Some believed he was the spirit of a man who had died in those woods long ago, a man who now sought revenge or company in his eternal loneliness. I returned to the cabin with a growing sense of dread. The figure wasn't just a figment of my imagination. He was real, and I might be his next victim. That night I stayed up, determined to confront him. I sat by the window, staring into the darkness, waiting. Around midnight he appeared, closer than ever. His eyes seemed to bore into mine, filled with a sadness and malice that made my blood run cold. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife and stepped outside, my heart pounding. I shouted into the night, demanding to know what he wanted, but the figure didn't move. I took a step forward, then another. He remained still, his dark eyes following my every move. As I approached, the air grew colder, and a sense of overwhelming dread washed over me. The figure seemed to fade, becoming less substantial, like smoke in the wind. I reached out, my hand trembling, but he vanished just as my fingers brushed the air where he had stood. I stumbled back to the cabin, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I packed my things hurriedly, throwing everything into my bags. As I zipped up my backpack, I heard a whisper, a soft, mournful sound that sent shivers down my spine. The figure was inside the cabin, standing by the door, his eyes fixed on me. I bolted for the door, pushing past him. The cold seemed to cling to me, and I felt a tug, as if something was trying to hold me back. But I broke free and ran into the woods, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove away, not daring to look back. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked all the doors and windows, but the sense of dread lingered. I never went back to the cabin, and I never told anyone what happened. It seemed too unreal, too terrifying to share. But the Watcher haunts my dreams. I see his eyes, feel his cold presence. I know he's still out there, waiting for his next victim. The cabin stands empty now, a silent sentinel in the woods hiding its dark history. And I know that no matter how far I run, I will never truly escape the Watcher in the woods. The memory of his gaze follows me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of the light. My girlfriend, Anna, and I had planned a hiking trip to escape the noise of the city. We both loved the outdoors and had been looking forward to this adventure for months. The trail was more remote than we expected, winding through dense forest and steep hills. As we hiked, dark clouds began to gather, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. We were a few miles from our campsite when the storm hit. The rain came down in sheets, and the wind whipped through the trees, making it impossible to continue. We needed shelter, and fast. That's when we saw it, a small, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. It looked old, weathered by years of neglect, but it was our only option. We hurried inside, grateful for the shelter. The cabin was dark and musty, with cobwebs in every corner and a thick layer of dust covering everything. We set our backpacks down and took in our surroundings. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the rain pounding on the roof. As the storm raged outside, we explored the cabin. It was small, just one main room with a fireplace, a rickety table, and a couple of chairs. In the corner, we found a trapdoor partially hidden under an old rug. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to see what was below. The trapdoor creaked loudly as we opened it, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. I found a flashlight in my backpack and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing stone steps slick with moisture. We descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we found a basement that seemed out of place. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange artifacts, bones, jars filled with dark liquids, and odd symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, and on it, an old, leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal, my hands shaking slightly. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with spidery handwriting. As I read, a sense of dread settled over me. The journal detailed dark rituals, descriptions of sacrifices, and invocations to ancient, malevolent entities. It spoke of a group that once used the cabin for their dark ceremonies, drawing power from the suffering they inflicted. Anna and I exchanged uneasy glances. We needed to get out of there. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on us. We hurried back up the stairs, our footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. But as we reached the top, the trapdoor slammed shut with a force that rattled the whole cabin. We were trapped. I pushed and pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the realization hit us. Something didn't want us to leave. We were at the mercy of whatever dark force lingered in the cabin. The room grew colder, and the air felt heavy, pressing down on us. The whispers started soon after, faint at first but growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around us, echoing off the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, malevolent and angry. We tried to break open the door, using anything we could find as tools, but nothing worked. Exhausted and terrified, we slumped to the floor, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The whispers continued, a constant, maddening presence. Desperation led us back to the journal. Maybe it held some clue, some way to break free. We pored over the pages, searching for anything that could help. Finally, We found a passage that seemed to describe a way to banish the force that held us. It required us to perform a ritual, using some of the strange artifacts from the basement. With no other options, we decided to try it. We gathered the items: a bone, a jar of dark liquid, and a carved stone. Following the instructions, we arranged them on the table and began the ritual. The air grew colder still, and the whispers intensified, almost deafening. As we completed the ritual, a sudden silence fell over the cabin. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air seemed to clear. We tried the trapdoor again, and this time it opened easily. We scrambled out of the basement, not daring to look back. The storm had passed, leaving the forest wet and glistening in the weak sunlight. We grabbed our backpacks and fled the cabin, running down the trail until we reached our campsite. We packed up quickly and hiked back to the car, the sense of dread finally easing as we left the cabin far behind. The experience haunted us for weeks. We couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something truly evil. The journal, the artifacts, the whispers, they lingered in our minds, a constant reminder of the dark history we had stumbled upon. We never spoke of it to anyone. It felt too surreal, too horrifying to share. But we knew the truth. The cabin was a place of darkness, and we had been lucky to escape with our lives. From then on, we stuck to well-known trails, avoiding any place that felt too remote, too isolated. The memory of that day served as a warning. Some places are best left undisturbed, their dark secrets buried in the past. We had stumbled upon something ancient and malevolent, and it had almost claimed us. The forest held its own kind of danger, one that went beyond the physical, into the realm of the unknown and the terrifying. Our family vacation at the lake cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. My wife, Laura, our 2 children, Max and Lily, and I had been looking forward to a week of fishing, swimming, and relaxing in the quiet of nature. The cabin was quaint and charming, nestled on the edge of a pristine lake, surrounded by dense woods. The first couple of days were perfect: sunny skies, laughter, and the simple joy of being together away from the bustle of our everyday lives. On the 3rd night, things changed. We were all settling in for bed after a long day of activities. The kids were asleep, and Laura and I were reading in the living room. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. Suddenly I heard something, faint voices, almost imperceptible, coming from below us. At first I thought it was the wind, but the voices persisted, growing slightly louder. I glanced at Laura, who seemed oblivious, absorbed in her book. I decided not to mention it, hoping it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the whispers continued, filling the silence with an unsettling presence. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the morning investigating the cabin. It was an old structure, with creaky floors and walls that seemed to groan with age. In the kitchen, I found a door leading to the basement. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusty. I fetched a screwdriver and managed to pry it open. The basement was dark and damp, with a musty smell that made me wrinkle my nose. I found a light switch and flicked it on. A single bare bulb cast a weak glow over the room. The space was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and thick cobwebs. As I explored, I noticed strange carvings on the stone walls, symbols and shapes that looked ancient and foreboding. In the center of the basement was a sealed well, covered with a heavy stone lid. It looked out of place, like it belonged to a different time. As I approached, I felt a chill run down my spine. The whispers were louder here, more distinct. They seemed to emanate from the well, filling the air with an eerie, desperate tone. I backed away, my heart racing. I decided not to tell Laura or the kids about my discovery. There was no need to worry them, I thought. Maybe it was just an old well, nothing more. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong with this place. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, crying out in anguish. Laura heard them too this time. We both lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the sounds. We agreed to check the basement together in the morning. The next day, armed with flashlights and a sense of trepidation, we descended into the basement. The voices grew louder as we approached the well. Laura was visibly shaken, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. We examined the carvings on the walls more closely. They depicted scenes of rituals, sacrifices, and dark ceremonies. It was clear now that this place had a sinister past. I knew we had to do something. The voices were growing more desperate, more demanding. It felt like the cabin itself was alive, filled with a malevolent presence that was growing stronger. I decided to try and open the well. Maybe if we confronted whatever was inside, we could end this nightmare. It took all my strength to move the stone lid. As I pried it open, a rush of cold air escaped, carrying with it a foul stench. The whispers became deafening, filling the basement with their horrific cacophony. I shone my flashlight into the well, revealing nothing but darkness. Laura clung to my arm, her eyes wide with fear. We stood there, paralyzed by the overwhelming presence that seemed to rise from the depths of the well. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the whispers. Then, a shadowy figure began to emerge, slowly climbing out of the well. It was a twisted, ghastly form, its eyes glowing with malevolence. In that moment, I knew we had to act. I grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and thrust it at the figure, trying to push it back into the well. Laura joined in, and together we managed to force the lid back into place. The figure let out a piercing scream as it was sealed back into the darkness. We ran upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind us. We could still hear faint whispers, but they were growing weaker. We knew we couldn't stay. We packed our things in a frenzy, waking the kids and telling them we had to leave immediately. As we drove away from the cabin, the whispers faded into the distance. We didn't look back, our minds reeling from the horror we had just experienced. It took days for us to feel safe again, to shake off the lingering sense of dread. Back home, I did some research and discovered that the area had a dark history. The cabin was built on the site of an ancient ritual ground, where a cult had performed dark ceremonies centuries ago. The well had been used to imprison a malevolent entity, one that had claimed the souls of those who lived there over the years. We were lucky to escape. The entity had tried to claim us, but we had managed to resist. The experience left us haunted, wary of any place with a dark past. We vowed never to return to the cabin, to leave its sinister history buried in the woods. The memory of that vacation still haunts us, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the darkness that lies beneath. We were fortunate to survive, to return to our normal lives. But we knew that the entity remained trapped, waiting for its next chance to escape, to claim more souls. We never spoke of it to anyone. It felt too unreal, too terrifying to share. But we knew the truth. Some places are best left undisturbed, their dark secrets buried in the past. And we were grateful to have escaped the cabin by the lake, leaving its malevolent presence behind forever. We were a group of 5, Emily, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and me. We had rented a remote cabin for the weekend, eager to escape our busy lives. The drive up was long but scenic, winding roads through dense forests. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The cabin was cozy and rustic, surrounded by towering pines and a quiet, serene lake just a short walk away. We unpacked quickly, excited to start our weekend. By the time we settled in, it was dusk. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories. It was perfect. As the sky darkened, an eerie calm settled over the woods. The night was silent, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, almost unnatural. We were tired from the drive, so we decided to turn in early. I lay in bed, listening to the wind rustling the leaves outside, trying to let the peacefulness lull me to sleep. Sometime around midnight, I heard it, whispers. At first, I thought it was Emily talking in her sleep, but the whispers seemed to come from outside, faint and indistinct. I sat up, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, mingling with what sounded like footsteps crunching on the forest floor. My heart began to race. I crept to the window, careful not to wake the others. The moon cast an eerie glow on the clearing outside, but I saw nothing unusual. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Trying to shake off the unease, I climbed back into bed and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I mentioned the sounds to the others. Mike laughed it off, saying it was probably an animal, while Sarah teased me about my overactive imagination. Emily and Jake seemed more concerned, but we all decided to brush it off and enjoy the day. We spent the day hiking, swimming in the lake, and exploring the woods. The fresh air and sunshine did wonders for our spirits, and by the time we returned to the cabin, I had almost forgotten about the whispers. We cooked dinner, played cards, and shared more stories around the fire. As night fell, the same heavy silence returned. We were all a bit on edge, but we tried to ignore it. We went to bed, and soon, the cabin was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wood and the soft breathing of my friends. Just past midnight, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. I could hear distinct words now, though they were in a language I didn't understand. The footsteps were back too, circling the cabin. My skin prickled with fear. I got up and checked on the others. They were all asleep, seemingly undisturbed. I tiptoed to the living room and peered out the windows. Shadows danced among the trees, but I saw no one. The whispers seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding the cabin. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran to wake Mike and Jake. They groggily followed me to the living room, but by the time we got there, everything was silent again. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. They nodded, eyes wide with fear. We stood there for a while, listening, but the whispers and footsteps had stopped. We checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Convinced it was some prank or an animal, we eventually went back to bed, though none of us slept well. The next day, we were all on edge. We decided to stay close to the cabin, not wanting to venture too far into the woods. As the day wore on, the tension eased a bit, and we tried to convince ourselves that it had all been our imaginations. That night, the whispers started earlier, just after we had gone to bed. They were louder, clearer. I could hear voices now, multiple voices speaking in urgent, hushed tones. The footsteps were heavier, closer. My fear turned into a cold dread. This time, we all heard it. We gathered in the living room, huddled together, listening. The whispers seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around us. The footsteps circled the cabin, stopping just outside the windows. We were terrified, unsure of what to do. Mike suggested we leave, but it was the middle of the night, and the thought of venturing into the dark woods was even more terrifying. We decided to stay together in the living room, hoping morning would bring some clarity. We didn't sleep that night. The whispers and footsteps continued, relentless. By dawn, we were exhausted and terrified. We packed up our things, deciding to leave as soon as possible. As we loaded the car, I noticed something strange. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints, but they weren't ours. They were larger, deeper, and seemed to come from all directions. My heart sank as I realized we had been surrounded all night. We drove away in silence, the tension thick in the air. As we made our way down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed darker, more menacing. We finally reached the main road and breathed a collective sigh of relief. The further we got from the cabin, the lighter the air felt. By the time we reached home, it almost felt like a bad dream. but the whispers haunted me. At night, in the quiet moments, I could still hear them, faint and distant. I researched the area, hoping to find some explanation. What I found chilled me to the bone. The cabin had a dark history. Decades ago, a group of campers had gone missing in those woods. Their bodies were never found, but locals claimed their spirits haunted the area, trapping anyone who stayed too long. We were lucky to have escaped. The spirits, it seemed, had let us go. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. I warned others about the cabin, hoping to prevent anyone else from experiencing what we did. The experience changed us. We no longer craved the solitude of the woods, preferring the safety of civilization. The whispers, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, they stayed with us, a reminder of the night we spent in the haunted cabin. Looking back, I realize how close we came to becoming part of the cabin's dark history. We were fortunate to have left when we did, to have recognized the danger before it was too late. The spirits of the woods had let us go, but I knew others might not be so lucky. Now, whenever I hear the wind rustling the leaves or the creak of a floorboard, I am reminded of that night. It serves as a warning. Some places are best left undisturbed, and the past can linger in the most unexpected ways.